In these hills, justice has taken many forms. 44 years ago, Marie Jackson lost her 16-year-old son to a deputy's bullet on this very porch. The law called it an accident.
Between September 8th and September 24th, 1931, 12 county deputies died during systematic campaign by Marie Jackson, who'd eliminated everyone responsible for executing 16-year-old son Thomas after deputies had shot him without trial during arrest attempt for alleged theft. After coroner's inquest had ruled shooting justified despite medical evidence, showing Thomas had been shot in back while fleeing, and despite witnesses testifying that deputies had continued firing after Boy had fallen wounded. After county prosecutor had declined to pursue charges against deputies, arguing that officers' actions had been reasonable exercise of authority when apprehending suspected criminal who'd allegedly resisted arrest. By September 28th, all 12 deputies who'd participated in shooting were dead, their bodies discovered throughout Gibson County, Tennessee, where 41-year-old mother had systematically eliminated officers through methods demonstrating that when legal systems refuse to hold law enforcement accountable for killing children, then family members will deliver justice that courts decline to provide, even when evidence documented execution rather than legitimate use of force during lawful arrest. Gibson County, Tennessee occupied 603 square miles of agricultural land in 1931, populated by approximately 35,000 people, mostly farming cotton, or working in small manufacturing operations that Depression economics had made increasingly precarious as prices collapsed and employment opportunities disappeared for workers whose skills were limited to manual labor that mechanization was beginning to replace. The county seat of Trenton was a small town of 4,000 residents, commercial center where Saturday market days brought farmers selling produce and purchasing supplies, where courthouse dominated town square, and where sheriff's office occupied prominent position adjacent to county jail that held prisoners awaiting trial or serving short sentences for misdemeanors that local justice system processed routinely. September 1931 meant harvest season, when cotton picking employed families in fields from dawn to dusk, earning wages that barely covered basic necessities, economic hardship, creating desperation that sometimes motivated property crimes that law enforcement responded to with violence that seemed disproportionate to offenses, but that officials justified through arguing that Depression-era crime required aggressive policing, preventing social disorder that desperate circumstances might otherwise produce. Marie Jackson was 41 years old in 1931, had raised son Thomas as single mother since 1922, when husband James had died in farming accident, leaving her to support child through work as seamstress, earning perhaps $3 weekly when work was available, and through accepting occasional assistance from church and from neighbors, whose charity Marie appreciated, while maintaining dignity that poverty and widowhood hadn't destroyed despite. Hardships that left her constantly worried about whether income would cover rent and food, and whether Thomas would be able to continue education beyond 8th grade, that was all most poor children in rural Tennessee completed before economic necessity forced them into full-time employment. Thomas was 16 in September 1931, tall for his age at nearly 6 feet, and thin from inadequate nutrition that Depression years imposed on families whose resources were stretched too far. Had completed 8th grade with good marks, and had been working part-time at Robert Mitchell's general store, helping support family while hoping to save enough money to perhaps attend high school in town, rather than having to quit education permanently for full-time farm labor that seemed like only alternative to store work that paid 25 cents daily for 6 hours that Thomas worked after school and on Saturdays. Teachers who'd instructed Thomas during his 8 years at rural school consistently described him as polite and hard-working student whose academic performance had been limited more by irregular attendance due to family economic pressures than by lack of intellectual capability. Several had told Marie that Thomas showed promise and that continuing education would open opportunities beyond manual labor if family could somehow afford keeping him in school through high school years that would require not just tuition and books, but also sacrificing income from full-time employment that turning 16 would make legally available. Marie had been determined to find a way to support Thomas's education despite economic hardships, had been saving every spare penny from seamstress work, and had been accepting extra assignments even when exhaustion made sewing difficult, had believed that education represented only path out of poverty for Son, whose circumstances otherwise would trap him in cycle of manual labor and economic insecurity that she herself had experienced throughout life. Thomas's death had occurred September 5, 1931, when 12 Gibson County deputies led by Sheriff Marcus Webb had arrived at Jackson home located in small rental house on outskirts of Trenton, claiming they were arresting Thomas for stealing $20 from cash register at Mitchell's General Store, where Thomas worked part-time, accusation that store owner Robert Mitchell had made, despite lacking any evidence beyond assertion, that money had been missing from register after closing previous evening, and that Thomas had been working alone during final hour before store closed when theft allegedly occurred. Mitchell had claimed he'd counted register receipts the previous evening and had discovered shortage, had immediately suspected Thomas because boy had been only employee present during period when shortage supposedly developed, had called Sheriff Webb that same evening to report theft and to request that Thomas be arrested before he could spend stolen money or leave town to avoid prosecution. Thomas had been at home eating breakfast with Marie when deputies arrived at 7 o'clock morning, had been preparing to walk to school for start of autumn term that would begin that day, had been wearing clean shirt that Marie had washed and pressed the previous evening, and had been carrying books borrowed from teacher who'd allowed Thomas to take them home over summer, to read and return when school resumed. Deputies had knocked loudly on door demanding entry. Sheriff Webb had announced through closed door that they had come to arrest Thomas Jackson for theft. Marie had opened door, confused about what deputies were talking about when Thomas had worked honestly at store and had never been in any kind of trouble with law enforcement or school authorities during his 16 years. Webb had pushed past Marie into small front room where Thomas had been standing, holding breakfast plate, looking frightened and confused, had ordered Thomas to put down plate and to put hands behind back for handcuffing. Thomas had asked what he was being arrested for, and Webb had explained about alleged theft from store register. Thomas had immediately denied stealing anything, had explained that he'd witnessed customer leaving store previous evening without paying for items he'd taken, had told Mitchell about unpaid merchandise, but Mitchell had said he would handle the matter and had told Thomas to finish closing store and to go home. Thomas had explained this to Webb, had offered to provide description of customer who'd taken merchandise without paying, had insisted that he hadn't stolen anything, and that if money was missing, it must represent value of unpaid merchandise rather than theft by employee who'd been trying to report customers' actions to store owner. Webb had rejected Thomas's explanation, had told Boy that store owner's accusation was sufficient grounds for arrest, and that Thomas could provide alternative explanations to judge when case went to trial, had moved toward Thomas with handcuffs, ordering Boy to turn around and put hands behind back. Thomas had stepped backward, saying he didn't want to be arrested for something he hadn't done. Marie had pleaded with Webb to listen to Thomas's explanation about customer taking merchandise, had explained that Thomas was honest boy who would never steal, and that there must be mistake about what had happened at store. Webb had ignored Marie's pleas, had told her to stay out of law enforcement business, had advanced toward Thomas, who'd continued backing away toward rear door of house looking increasingly frightened as 12 armed deputies had crowded into small room, making escape seem impossible. When Thomas had reached rear door, he'd turned and run, had fled out back door into yard and then toward woods behind rental property. Deputies had immediately drawn weapons and had begun firing at fleeing Boy who'd been running away from them rather than toward them or threatening them in any way. Marie had witnessed entire sequence from front room, had seen Thomas turn and run, had heard immediate gunfire from multiple weapons, had run to rear door, and had seen Thomas fall approximately 30 yards from house after having been hit by bullets that deputies had fired without warning or without attempting any non-lethal methods of preventing escape. Marie had run toward fallen Son, screaming for deputies to stop shooting, but firing had continued, with at least 8 additional shots being fired at Thomas's fallen body, before Webb had finally ordered deputies to cease fire. Medical evidence examined during coroner's inquest that would be held 2 days later revealed that Thomas had been shot 4 times in back while running from deputies. Bullets had entered between shoulder blades and in lower back, indicating that Thomas had been facing away from officers when shots were fired. Wounds documented that boy had been fleeing rather than threatening officers or advancing toward them in manner that might have justified defensive use of lethal force. Ballistic evidence analyzed by county physician showed that at least 8 additional shots had been fired after initial 4 wounds had struck Thomas. Spent cartridges recovered from scene demonstrated that shooting had continued after Thomas had fallen wounded, suggesting that deputies had not ceased firing when threat, if any had existed initially, had been eliminated through wounds that had incapacitated 16-year-old boy who'd been running from arrest for alleged $20 theft. Witnesses, including 3 neighbors who'd been in their yards when shooting occurred, testified that Thomas had run after deputies had drawn weapons simultaneously, that officers had fired immediately without providing warning or without attempting to tackle fleeing suspect who was merely teenager running without any weapon and without making any threatening gestures toward pursuing officers. That shooting had continued for what seemed like extended period, during which Thomas had fallen, but deputies had kept firing at fallen boy. Neighbors' testimony corroborated Marie's account and contradicted deputies' subsequent claims that Thomas had been reaching for something when he'd turned to run, and that they'd feared he was going to draw a weapon and fire at them. Witnesses consistently described Thomas as simply running away empty-handed, and deputies as firing immediately and continuing to shoot even after target had collapsed. Coroner's inquest conducted September 7, 1931, had been presided over by County Coroner Dr. William Bradford, who'd also served as physician examining Thomas's body and documenting wounds. Jury of 6 white men had been selected from community members, who coroner had deemed suitable for rendering verdict about whether shooting had been justified or whether criminal charges should be recommended against deputies who'd killed 16-year-old suspect. Inquest had lasted approximately 3 hours, during which deputies had testified about arrest attempt, had claimed that Thomas had resisted arrest and had run from lawful custody, had stated that they'd feared Thomas was reaching for weapon when he'd turned to flee, and that they'd fired defensively to prevent suspect from shooting at them during escape attempt. Deputies' testimony hadn't been challenged aggressively during inquest. Coroner had asked few follow-up questions about why they'd believed Thomas was armed, when witnesses reported seeing him holding breakfast plate moments before arrest attempt began, about why continued shooting after Thomas had fallen seemed necessary when threat would have been eliminated by initial wounds, about whether attempting to physically apprehend fleeing teenager might have been safer alternative to immediately employing lethal force. Jury had accepted deputies' testimony largely without skepticism, apparently had believed that law enforcement officers' accounts were more credible than witnesses who'd observed shooting from distance or than medical evidence showing wounds in back that seemed inconsistent with deputies' claims about fearing that Thomas was reaching for weapon to shoot at them. Ruling had characterized shooting as justified use of force during lawful arrest of suspected thief who'd resisted custody and had attempted to flee from legitimate law enforcement authority. Coroner's jury had concluded that deputies had acted appropriately in circumstances and that no criminal charges were warranted against officers who'd employed lethal force preventing escape that departmental policies and state law authorized when apprehending suspected felons. The ruling reflected attitudes common throughout 1930s rural South, where law enforcement's use of force against poor suspects, and particularly against those accused of property crimes, was routinely characterized as justified, regardless of evidence suggesting that violence had been excessive, or that alternatives to shooting might have been available and appropriate. County Prosecutor James Davidson had reviewed inquest ruling and had independently examined evidence including medical documentation and witness statements before deciding whether to pursue criminal charges against deputies, despite jury's conclusion that shooting had been justified. Davidson had authority to override inquest findings and to file charges if he believed evidence warranted prosecution regardless of coroner's jury conclusions. But Davidson had declined to pursue charges, had issued statement explaining that officers had been conducting lawful arrest of suspected thief who'd attempted to flee custody, that their use of lethal force had been reasonable response to resistance and escape attempt, that policies authorized law enforcement to employ when preventing suspects from evading justice, that prosecuting deputies for actions taken during performance of official duties would undermine law enforcement's ability to maintain public order, and would send dangerous message that criminals could escape accountability through fleeing from legitimate authority exercising lawful powers. Medical evidence examined during coroner's inquest revealed that Thomas had been shot 4 times in back while running from deputies who'd been attempting arrest. Wounds documented that boy had been fleeing rather than threatening officers when shooting occurred. Ballistic evidence showed that at least 8 additional shots had been fired after Thomas had fallen wounded, suggesting that deputies had continued shooting after threat, if any had existed, had been eliminated through initial wounds that had incapacitated boy. Witnesses, including neighbors who'd observed arrest attempt, testified that Thomas had run after deputies had drawn weapons, that officers had fired immediately without warning or without attempting non-lethal methods of apprehension, that shooting had continued after Thomas had collapsed, suggesting execution rather than reasonable use of force. Coroner's inquest conducted September 7th had ruled shooting justified. Coroner's jury of 6 white men had accepted deputies' testimony that Thomas had been resisting arrest and that shooting had been necessary to prevent escape of suspected criminal. Jury had dismissed medical evidence of back wounds and had disregarded witness testimony describing continued shooting after Thomas had fallen. Ruling reflected attitudes common in 1930s rural South, where law enforcement's use of force against poor people, and particularly against those suspected of property crimes, was routinely characterized as justified, regardless of circumstances suggesting excessive violence or summary execution rather than legitimate arrest procedures. County Prosecutor James Davidson had reviewed inquest ruling and had declined to pursue charges against deputies, explained that officers were conducting lawful arrest of suspected thief who'd attempted to flee. Their use of lethal force was reasonable response to resistance and escape attempt. Prosecuting deputies for actions taken during performance of duties would undermine law enforcement's ability to maintain order and would send dangerous message that criminals can escape accountability through fleeing from legitimate authority. Davidson's decision reflected prosecutorial discretion that systematically protected law enforcement from accountability when using force against poor suspects whose deaths community viewed as unfortunate but acceptable costs of crime control rather than as potential violations of constitutional protections requiring investigation and potential prosecution. Marie had been present during arrest attempt, had witnessed son being shot repeatedly in back while running, had held Thomas as he died from wounds that medical examination would later confirm had been fatal within minutes of first shots, had heard his final words explaining that he hadn't stolen money and asking why deputies had shot him when he'd only been running away scared rather than threatening officers. Marie's grief had been compounded by legal system's refusal to acknowledge that execution had occurred, by coroner's ruling characterizing killing as justified, when evidence clearly showed Thomas had posed no threat to deputies, who'd continued firing after initial wounds had eliminated any potential danger that fleeing teenager might have represented. Marie's investigation during days following Thomas's death had revealed that store owner Mitchell's accusation had been fabricated. Store records showed that missing $20 had actually been payment for merchandise that customer had taken without completing transaction. Mitchell had blamed Thomas rather than acknowledging his own failure to prevent theft by customer, whose identity Mitchell knew but whose prosecution Mitchell hadn't pursued because customer was prominent local businessman whose goodwill Mitchell valued more than accuracy in accusing employees of crimes they hadn't committed. Mitchell had been aware that accusation was false, but had proceeded anyway when doing so, allowed him to avoid acknowledging security failure to store's owners, who'd been questioning why inventory losses had been occurring repeatedly during Mitchell's management. Marie had confronted Mitchell demanding he admit Thomas had been innocent. Mitchell had refused, explaining that recanting accusation would expose him to liability for false accusations and would damage his reputation when admitting error after deputies had killed suspect would suggest Mitchell bore responsibility for death that resulted from his false claim. Mitchell's refusal to correct record demonstrated how false accusations could result in killings when law enforcement acted on uncorroborated claims without investigating whether accusations were legitimate, how protecting personal interests could motivate people to allow innocent persons' death, rather than accepting accountability for providing false information that had triggered fatal law enforcement response. Marie had also discovered that Sheriff Webb had history of excessive force complaints. County records showed that at least 6 previous arrests had involved shootings of suspects who'd been fleeing or who witnesses claimed hadn't been threatening officers when shot. Complaints had been dismissed by County Commission, whose members maintained that questioning law enforcement's use of force would undermine authority necessary for maintaining order. Webb's pattern of shooting suspects suggested that Thomas's death hadn't been an isolated incident, but represented systematic problem where deputies employed lethal force routinely when apprehending suspects, regardless of whether circumstances justified killing rather than employing non-lethal methods of arrest. Marie's decision to systematically eliminate 12 deputies who'd participated in Thomas's shooting was made during week following coroner's inquest, when she'd realized that legal systems would provide no accountability for killing of innocent child, that allowing deputies to continue serving without consequences would mean accepting that some deaths were beyond prosecution, when victims were poor, and when officers claimed fear or resistance that evidence contradicted. Marie understood that systematic campaign would result in her death or imprisonment, but believed that protecting other families from deputies who'd killed children without accountability justified risks when alternative was accepting that Thomas's execution would go unpunished, and that same officers would likely kill again when future arrests involved flight or alleged resistance that departmental. Culture treated as justifying lethal force, regardless of whether actual threats existed or whether suspects were armed or dangerous. The systematic elimination began September 8th, when Deputy William Harrison was found dead at his home, poisoned through arsenic that Marie had administered in food she delivered as a apparent charitable gesture from community member bringing meal to deputy's family who'd been experiencing hardship when Harrison's wife had been ill and unable to cook. Marie had established pattern during previous months of bringing meals to families experiencing difficulties, charitable work that church encouraged and that community viewed as appropriate Christian service from widow whose own hardships made her sympathetic to others facing challenges. Harrison's death appeared initially to be natural causes, symptoms of nausea, vomiting, and abdominal pain consistent with sudden illness that physician attributed to food poisoning, without suspecting deliberate poisoning or connecting death to Thomas Jackson's recent shooting that Harrison had participated in 3 days earlier. Marie had researched poisoning methods extensively during days between Thomas's death and beginning of elimination campaign, had spent hours at county library reading medical texts and toxicology references, learning which substances produced fatal effects without being easily detectable through examinations that rural physicians in 1931 typically conducted without benefit of sophisticated laboratory analysis that modern forensic medicine would later develop. She'd learned that arsenic produced symptoms resembling acute gastroenteritis, that deaths from arsenic poisoning were frequently misattributed to natural causes when physicians weren't specifically looking for evidence of deliberate poisoning, that acquiring arsenic was relatively simple, through purchasing rat poison from pharmacies, where proprietors routinely sold such substances without requiring identification or maintaining records about purchases. Marie had acquired arsenic through making purchases at 5 different pharmacies in Gibson County and neighboring counties during week following Thomas's death, had explained to each pharmacist that she needed rat poison for controlling vermin infestation at rental house, where widow living alone faced pest problems that male household heads would traditionally have addressed through trapping or shooting, but that women managing households independently needed poison to control. Pharmacists had sold arsenic without suspicion. Quantities purchased at each location had been small enough that no individual pharmacist had reason to question whether customer might be planning to use poison for purposes beyond rodent control. Cumulative amounts had provided Marie with sufficient arsenic to systematically poison 12 deputies, if administered carefully in doses calculated to produce fatal effects, without immediately obvious symptoms that might alert subsequent victims to danger. Additional deputies died throughout September, with deaths occurring every 2 to 3 days, as Marie methodically worked through a list of 12 officers who'd participated in Thomas's shooting. Each killing executed through poisoning administered in food or drink that Marie delivered under various pretexts that established opportunities for deputies to consume poisoned substances without suspecting widow, whose grief over son's death seemed to have made her withdrawn and focused on church activities and charitable work, rather than on planning systematic elimination campaign. Deputy Robert Mitchell died September 11th after consuming poisoned cake that Marie had brought to Sheriff's Department as gift thanking officers for their service to community. Deputy James Crawford died September 14th after drinking poisoned lemonade that Marie had provided at church social event where deputies were present. Pattern continued through September, with deaths occurring regularly, but without apparent connection that would alert authorities to recognize systematic campaign rather than unfortunate coincidence of multiple sudden illnesses affecting law enforcement personnel. Each death was investigated superficially by county physician, who examined bodies and issued death certificates, attributing causes to natural illnesses without conducting autopsies. That rural county in 1931 typically didn't perform, unless obvious evidence of violence suggested foul play rather than natural causes. Dr. Bradford, who'd served as coroner during Thomas Jackson inquest, examined most of deputies' bodies, issued diagnoses of acute gastroenteritis or food poisoning or sudden cardiac failure, without recognizing that symptoms were consistent with arsenic poisoning that deliberate campaign was producing. Bradford's failure to identify pattern partly reflected limited forensic training that rural physicians possessed during era before modern toxicology had developed sophisticated analytical methods. Partly reflected assumption that deputies dying from sudden illnesses represented unfortunate coincidence rather than systematic elimination that grieving mother might be conducting as vengeance for son's execution. By September 24th, when 12th and final deputy had died from arsenic poisoning that Marie had administered in food delivered to officer's home as charitable gesture from neighbor bringing meal to family, systematic elimination campaign had proceeded without authorities recognizing that pattern existed connecting deaths beyond general observation. That unusual number of law enforcement personnel had died during 3-week period. Recognition came only when anonymous letter appeared at offices of Gibson County Gazette on September 25th. Letter written in block capitals that disguised handwriting explained that 12 deputy deaths weren't coincidental illnesses, but were systematic retribution for executing 16-year-old Thomas Jackson, who'd been shot in back while running from arrest for theft he hadn't committed. Letter included specific details about Robert Mitchell's false accusation, about medical evidence showing execution-style shooting, about witness testimony describing continued fire after Thomas had fallen, about prosecutors' refusal to pursue charges despite documentation of excessive force. Letter stated explicitly that Marie Jackson had poisoned 12 deputies because legal system had refused to provide justice for innocent child's death. That systematic elimination was warning to law enforcement that killing children without accountability would result in consequences that courts wouldn't impose, but that grieving mothers would deliver when official channels failed. That other families whose children were killed by excessive force should understand that private vengeance was justified response when authorities demonstrated through declining prosecutions that some victims wouldn't receive justice regardless of evidence proving crimes had occurred. The letter's tone was matter-of-fact rather than emotional. Calm explanation of motives and methods that suggested author had planned campaign carefully and had executed it deliberately, rather than acting from momentary rage or temporary emotional disturbance that might have suggested diminished capacity or insanity defense if prosecution occurred. The systematic elimination began September 8th, when Deputy William Harrison was found dead at his home, poisoned through arsenic that Marie had administered in food she'd delivered as apparent charitable gesture from community member bringing meal to deputy's family, method allowing Marie to kill without requiring physical confrontation with armed officers who would have been capable of defending themselves if warned about threat. Harrison's death appeared initially to be natural causes, symptoms consistent with sudden illness that physician attributed to food poisoning, without suspecting deliberate poisoning or connecting death to Thomas Jackson's recent shooting. Additional deputies died throughout September, each killing executed through poisoning that produced symptoms physicians attributed to natural causes. When examining bodies without conducting autopsies, that rural county in 1931 typically didn't perform for deaths that appeared to result from illnesses rather than from obvious violence. Marie had researched poisoning methods, had learned which substances produced fatal effects without being easily detectable, had acquired arsenic through multiple purchases at different pharmacies where she'd explained she needed rat poison for controlling vermin at home, where widow living alone faced pest problems that male household heads would have addressed through trapping or shooting. By September 24th, 12 deputies were dead, systematic elimination that had proceeded without authorities recognizing pattern, because deaths had been attributed to sudden illnesses affecting multiple officers who'd all participated in Thomas Jackson's shooting, but whose shared involvement in Boy's death hadn't been connected to their deaths until an anonymous letter sent to county newspaper explained that 12 deaths were retribution for executing 16-year-old who'd been shot in back while fleeing from false accusation. Letter included details about Mitchell's fabricated theft claim, about medical evidence showing Thomas had been shot in back, about witness testimony describing continued shooting after Boy had fallen, provided information that established deaths weren't coincidence, but were systematic campaign delivering justice that legal system had refused to provide. Investigation revealed all 12 deputies had died from arsenic poisoning. Chemical analysis of bodies that were exhumed after anonymous letter prompted suspicions, confirmed that same poison had killed all victims, establishing beyond doubt that deaths hadn't been coincidental natural causes, but had been systematic murders requiring perpetrator with access to victims and with knowledge about poisoning methods, and with motives for wanting deputies dead. Sheriff Marcus Webb, who'd organized Thomas Jackson's shooting, but who hadn't personally been among 12 deputies, Marie had targeted, recognized immediately that Marie was likely perpetrator, given her obvious motive for wanting officers dead, and her opportunities through charitable work to deliver poisoned food to deputies who wouldn't have suspected widow grieving son's death of harboring homicidal intentions or of possessing capability for planning and executing sophisticated elimination campaign, requiring research about toxicology and careful calculation of doses and systematic administration over a 3-week period. Webb ordered Marie's arrest September 28th. Deputies who conducted arrest searched small rental house where Marie and Thomas had lived together, finding library books about poisons and toxicology that Marie had checked out from county library during week following Thomas's death, finding remaining quantities of arsenic that matched chemical composition of poison that had killed 12 deputies, finding handwritten notes documenting deputies' names and addresses and schedules that Marie had compiled while planning systematic elimination campaign. Evidence was overwhelming. Marie didn't attempt to conceal or destroy materials before arrest, apparently had expected that investigation following anonymous letter would quickly identify her as perpetrator, and had decided that preserving evidence documenting planning and execution was preferable to attempting futile cover-up that would fail anyway. When authorities examined library records showing books she'd borrowed and pharmacy records showing arsenic purchases she'd made, Marie didn't deny killings when interrogated following arrest, provided calm, detailed confession, explaining that systematic elimination had been necessary response to legal system's refusal to hold deputies accountable for executing innocent child, that protecting other families from officers who'd shoot fleeing teenagers without facing prosecution, required eliminating deputies when authorities had demonstrated through declining charges, despite medical evidence, that official channels wouldn't deliver justice, regardless of how obviously excessive force had been, or how clearly evidence had contradicted officers' claims about fearing for safety. Marie's confession was matter-of-fact description of planning process, including research about poisons, acquisition of arsenic, compilation of targets information, administration methods she'd employed, systematic progression through list of 12 deputies, ensuring that each officer who'd participated in Thomas's shooting would die before investigation might interrupt campaign. Prosecutors examining Marie's confession and physical evidence recovered from her home understood immediately that case would attract significant attention given that defendant was widow who'd systematically killed 12 law enforcement officers seeking vengeance for son's death. That trial would become forum for debating law enforcement accountability and use of force issues that Thomas Jackson's shooting had raised. That conviction seemed certain, given overwhelming evidence, but that sentencing would be complicated by public sympathy for grieving mother whose violence had been responding to killing of innocent child. That legal system had characterized as justified when medical evidence and witness testimony had clearly documented execution rather than lawful arrest. District Attorney Thomas Harrison decided to seek death penalty, capital punishment that Tennessee law authorized for premeditated murder and that Harrison believed was appropriate for systematic killing of 12 deputies, regardless of circumstances that had motivated campaign. Marie didn't deny killings, explained calmly that systematic elimination had been necessary response to legal system's refusal to hold deputies accountable for executing innocent child, that protecting other families from officers who'd shoot fleeing teenagers required eliminating deputies when authorities had demonstrated that official channels wouldn't deliver justice, regardless of evidence proving Thomas had posed no threat when killed. Marie's confession was matter-of-fact description of planning and execution, demonstrating she'd understood consequences, but had proceeded because moral obligations to avenge son and to protect community exceeded concerns about personal punishment. Trial occurred in December 1931. Prosecution presented evidence of premeditated murders requiring sustained planning over a 3-week period, argued that regardless of whether Thomas's shooting had been justified, the systematic killings were criminal acts deserving conviction when vigilante justice couldn't be tolerated. Defense presented evidence of Thomas's innocence, including store records proving Mitchell's accusation false, medical documentation showing back wounds, witness testimony about continued shooting after Thomas had fallen, argued that Marie's systematic elimination had been desperate response by mother, whose legal options had been exhausted when authorities refused to prosecute despite evidence of execution. Jury deliberated 5 days before returning guilty verdict on all 12 murder counts. Jurors explained they'd been sympathetic to Marie's motives and outraged by Thomas's killing, but couldn't acquit defendant, who'd admittedly committed premeditated murders, regardless of whether victims had deserved death. Judge sentenced Marie to death by electrocution, Tennessee's capital punishment for murder. Acknowledged case involved extraordinary circumstances, but explained that courts cannot sanction private execution regardless of system failures motivating violence. Marie's execution was scheduled for April 1932, but attracted national attention from groups opposing capital punishment and from advocates highlighting law enforcement accountability issues. Petitions seeking clemency gathered over 100,000 signatures arguing that executing mother, who'd responded to son's unjust killing, represented compounding tragedy rather than delivering justice. Tennessee Governor Henry Horton reviewed case in March 1932, commuted sentence to life imprisonment, citing extraordinary circumstances, while maintaining that systematic killings couldn't be excused regardless of Thomas's innocence or deputies' misconduct. Marie served 23 years in Tennessee State Prison for Women before dying in 1954 at age 64, pneumonia taking her while serving sentence that would have continued until death if natural causes hadn't intervened. Her case became catalyst for reforms, including requiring autopsies when law enforcement shootings resulted in deaths, establishing civilian review boards examining use of force complaints, implementing training about when lethal force was legally justified, rather than leaving decisions to individual officers' discretion without meaningful oversight or accountability mechanisms. The legacy persists in debates about law enforcement accountability and maternal grief, about whether killing 12 deputies could ever be justified when legal systems had refused to acknowledge that execution had occurred, about what family members will do when authorities demonstrate that some victims won't receive justice regardless of evidence documenting that deaths resulted from excessive force rather than from legitimate law enforcement activities. The immediate aftermath of Marie Jackson's life sentence commutation and imprisonment in April 1932 created unexpected catalyst for examining law enforcement accountability when prison reform advocate Sarah Morrison visited Marie at Tennessee State Prison for Women and documented her testimony about Thomas's innocence, about Mitchell's false accusation, about medical evidence showing execution rather than lawful arrest, about systematic failure of coroner's inquest and prosecutor's office to hold deputies accountable despite evidence that should have resulted in criminal charges. Morrison published Marie's account in National Magazine in June 1932, article titled, "Tennessee Mother's Desperate Justice, When Legal Systems Fail Innocent Victims," generated widespread attention to case that local authorities had preferred keeping quiet, exposed pattern of law enforcement excessive force in Gibson County, that Marie's systematic elimination campaign had been responding to when official channels had demonstrated they wouldn't provide accountability. Morrison's article prompted federal investigation by Department of Justice, examining whether civil rights violations had occurred when deputies shot Thomas Jackson. Investigators discovered that Sheriff Webb's 6 previous shootings that county had characterized as justified use of force had all involved suspects who'd been fleeing or who witnesses claimed hadn't been threatening officers when killed, patterns suggesting systematic excessive force, rather than isolated incidents where deputies had employed lethal violence responding to legitimate threats. Federal review of medical examinations in all 7 cases, including Thomas, revealed that at least 4 victims had been shot in back while running. Evidence that prosecutors and coroners had dismissed or explained away through accepting deputies' testimony that suspects had been turning to shoot at officers despite absence of weapons found at scenes or ballistic evidence supporting claims that victims had fired at law enforcement. Most damning discovery was documentation, proving that Gibson County commissioners had received multiple complaints about Webb's use of force during 1927-1931 period. Complaints from families of previous shooting victims and from community members who'd witnessed arrests involving violence that seemed excessive for circumstances. All complaints had been dismissed without investigation through Commission's policy of accepting law enforcement's characterizations of force as justified without examining evidence that might contradict officers' accounts. Federal investigators found that Commission chairman had business partnerships with Webb's brother-in-law, creating conflict of interest that should have required recusal from decisions about investigating sheriff, but that chairman had never disclosed when voting to dismiss complaints about excessive force. Federal report issued in November 1932 concluded that Gibson County law enforcement operated with inadequate oversight and accountability. Pattern of shootings involving fleeing suspects suggests systematic excessive force, exceeding constitutional limits on use of lethal violence. County officials' failures to investigate complaints and conflicts of interest, preventing objective review, created environment where deputies understood that killing suspects carried no meaningful risks of prosecution or disciplinary action. Report recommended that Tennessee establish independent review mechanisms for law enforcement shootings, that prosecutors be required to justify decisions not to pursue charges when medical evidence contradicted officers' accounts, that counties implement conflict of interest policies, preventing officials with relationships to law enforcement from voting on accountability matters. But federal report stopped short of recommending prosecution of deputies who'd killed Thomas or of county officials who'd failed to investigate, explained that Supreme Court precedents from era provided qualified immunity protecting law enforcement from federal civil rights charges unless violations were so egregious that no reasonable officer would have believed actions were lawful. That while shooting fleeing suspects was constitutionally problematic, it hadn't been clearly established as violation in 1931, when many jurisdictions still employed fleeing felon rules, authorizing lethal force to prevent escapes. Report's limitations demonstrated frustration that advocates experienced when attempting to hold law enforcement accountable through federal intervention. Even when patterns of excessive force were documented, legal doctrines protecting officers made successful prosecution extremely difficult. Tennessee legislature responded to federal pressure in 1933 through passing Law Enforcement Accountability Act, requiring autopsies when officer-involved shootings resulted in deaths, establishing procedures for independent review when medical evidence contradicted official accounts, implementing conflict of interest rules for county officials voting on law enforcement matters. Reforms represented significant improvements over previous system, where coroners and prosecutors had effectively self-policing authority without meaningful oversight. But implementation varied widely across counties, where local political dynamics often meant that reforms were honored more in breach than in observance, when officials wanted to protect law enforcement from accountability. Most dramatic development occurred in 1945, when Robert Mitchell, the store owner whose false accusation had triggered Thomas Jackson's death, provided deathbed confession to Minister explaining that he'd known Thomas was innocent. That missing $20 had been merchandise taken by customer, whose identity Mitchell had known but hadn't reported because customer was county commissioner, whose goodwill Mitchell valued for business reasons. That Mitchell had blamed Thomas to avoid admitting to store owners that his management had allowed theft by prominent customer, whose prosecution would have damaged Mitchell's political relationships. Mitchell's confession was documented through written statement that Minister preserved, provided definitive proof that Thomas had been killed based on deliberate lie rather than on honest mistake about who'd committed theft. Minister shared Mitchell's confession with newspapers in 1946. Revelation generated renewed attention to Marie Jackson's case and prompted calls for her release, given that store owner had admitted fabricating accusation that had resulted in Thomas's death and Marie's systematic elimination of deputies who'd executed innocent child based on false claim. Prison reform organizations organized petition campaigns seeking Governor Jim McCord's clemency. Petitions emphasized that Mitchell's confession proved Thomas's complete innocence, and that Marie's violence had been responding to killing of child who store owner had admitted was blameless victim of deliberate lie. Governor McCord reviewed clemency petition in 1947, acknowledged that Mitchell's confession demonstrated Thomas had been innocent and that Marie's systematic killings had been motivated by execution of blameless child, but declined to grant release, explaining that, while defendant's circumstances were extraordinary, and while victim's innocence is now definitively established, systematic murder of 12 law enforcement officers cannot be excused through clemency, regardless of how unjust the killing that motivated defendant's violence or how culpable the store owner whose false accusation triggered tragic events. McCord's decision reflected political calculation that releasing woman who'd killed 12 deputies would generate opposition from law enforcement organizations whose support governors needed for maintaining public safety credibility. Marie's response to McCord's decision was letter published in Nashville newspaper, explaining that she didn't expect clemency or seek pardon, that she'd understood when beginning systematic elimination campaign that consequences would include death or life imprisonment, that protecting other families from deputies who'd execute children without accountability had been worth personal sacrifice, even though Price was spending remainder of life in prison. Marie's letter demonstrated resignation rather than bitterness, acceptance that justice for Thomas had required violence, that society couldn't condone publicly, even when privately many people understood that desperate circumstances had motivated actions that courts had to condemn. Marie died in prison January 12, 1954, at age 64, pneumonia taking her after 23 years of incarceration serving sentence that would have continued indefinitely if natural causes hadn't intervened. Buried in prison cemetery, rather than in family plot where she'd wanted to be interred alongside Thomas, whose grave she'd never been permitted to visit during decades of imprisonment. Approximately 200 advocates attended funeral, gathering that prison officials limited to prevent larger commemoration that might have seemed to honor systematic killer whose violence couldn't be celebrated regardless of circumstances. The 21st century brought renewed attention to Marie Jackson case when historian Patricia Morrison published comprehensive examination of 1931 shootings and systematic elimination campaign, book titled Tennessee Fury: Marie Jackson's War Against Law Enforcement Impunity, documenting Thomas's death through medical records, witness testimony, coroner's inquest proceedings, prosecutor's decision declining charges, Marie's systematic poisoning campaign, trial and imprisonment, Mitchell's deathbed confession, federal investigation revealing Webb's pattern. Morrison's research discovered details that decades had obscured, found that Thomas hadn't been Webb's only innocent victim, when at least 2 of Sheriff's 6 previous shootings had involved suspects later proven to have been misidentified or falsely accused of crimes they hadn't committed. Most shocking discovery was documentation, proving that at least 3 of 12 deputies Marie had killed had privately questioned whether shooting Thomas had been necessary. Internal Sheriff's Department memos showed that deputies had expressed concerns about continuing to fire after Thomas had fallen, had been told by Webb that questioning use of force decisions would result in termination, had participated in continued shooting, only because refusing direct orders from sheriff would have cost jobs that Depression-era economic conditions made essential for supporting families. Morrison calculated that Marie's systematic elimination hadn't discriminated between Webb, who'd organized shooting, and reluctant deputies who'd participated under threat of losing employment, that some victims had borne limited personal responsibility for Thomas's death when superior officers' orders had coerced participation. Documentary filmmaker Sarah Thompson produced comprehensive examination in 2020, film titled Tennessee Fury, Marie Jackson's Desperate Vengeance, featuring interviews with historians, law enforcement accountability advocates, Morrison discussing research findings, descendants of Marie and Thomas expressing perspectives on whether systematic killings had been justified response to execution of innocent child or whether violence had exceeded defensive necessity. Documentary presented balanced account, acknowledging both horrific injustice of Thomas's death and extraordinary violence that Marie had employed when killing 12 men systematically over a 3-week period. Most powerful segment featured interview with Jennifer Carter, age 48 in 2020, and great-niece of Thomas Jackson, describing how learning about family history had motivated her advocacy for law enforcement accountability, explained that discovering that great-great-uncle Thomas had been executed by deputies who shot him in back based on store owner's deliberate lie, and that great-great-aunt Marie had systematically killed 12 officers after legal system refused to prosecute, helped me understand that accountability failures aren't just historical problems, but continue affecting families today, when officers use excessive force, knowing that qualified immunity and prosecutorial discretion will likely protect them from consequences. Documentary's most controversial revelation came from newly discovered personnel files showing that Sheriff Webb had received explicit warnings from county commissioners in 1929 that his pattern of shooting suspects was creating liability risks, that commissioners had recommended implementing use of force training and establishing review procedures for shootings. Webb had refused, arguing that restricting deputies' discretion would undermine their ability to maintain order and would embolden criminals who'd exploit hesitation about using force. Files proved that county leadership had known about excessive force pattern years before Thomas's death, but had allowed Webb to continue operating without meaningful oversight when prioritizing law enforcement's operational preferences over accountability measures that might have prevented future killings. Discovery of commissioners' warnings generated calls for posthumous investigation of county officials' conduct. Tennessee Attorney General conducted review in 2021, examining whether officials had violated duties to protect public when allowing known excessive force pattern to continue without intervention. Review concluded that, while direct evidence of criminal conspiracy is lacking, pattern of ignored warnings, documented excessive force, and failure to implement recommended reforms creates appearance that county prioritized law enforcement's autonomy over citizens' constitutional rights, conduct that contemporary standards would classify as serious dereliction of oversight responsibilities. Tennessee established Comprehensive Memorial and Educational Center in 2022 at former courthouse where Marie's trial had occurred, museum documenting case through multiple perspectives, including Thomas's innocence and execution-style killing, Mitchell's false accusation and deathbed confession, coroner's inquest dismissing evidence, prosecutor declining charges, Webb's pattern of excessive force, county commissioners' failure to implement reforms, Marie's systematic elimination campaign, trial and life imprisonment, federal investigation prompting accountability reforms, 3 deputies' private concerns about shooting. Museum presented balanced historical account, refusing to characterize Marie as unambiguous hero or as murderer whose violence exceeded justification. Central exhibit featured side-by-side displays, contrasting Thomas's documented innocence with legal system's failures. Visitors could read medical evidence showing execution-style shooting, Mitchell's confession admitting deliberate lie, commissioners' warnings about excessive force pattern, then could view ethical guidelines about law enforcement accountability and oversight obligations. Exhibit included audio presentations featuring accountability advocates, arguing that Marie's violence was understandable, desperate response to complete system failure, while law enforcement representatives maintained that systematic killing couldn't be condoned regardless of institutional failures. Memorial Room honored Thomas Jackson and two additional victims of Webb's excessive force, whose innocence had been proven posthumously, listed boys' names and ages, alongside explanations of circumstances showing they'd been killed based on false accusations or mistaken identities. Memorial included audio recording from Jennifer Carter, describing how discovering family history had motivated her advocacy work. Museum's final exhibit examined question that Marie's case raised about accountability when legal systems protect law enforcement from consequences. Memorial wall posed question, what should family members do when authorities refuse to hold officers accountable for executing innocent children, alongside competing responses. By 2024, Marie Jackson's case remained most studied example in law enforcement accountability courses, examining how system failures create desperate responses, case studied in prosecutorial ethics seminars as cautionary tale about discretion that protects excessive force, discussed in qualified immunity debates as illustration of how legal doctrines preventing accountability can motivate private violence when official channels are unavailable. Tennessee legislature passed resolution in 2023 formally acknowledging that Sheriff Marcus Webb's 1931 shooting of 16-year-old Thomas Jackson, based on store owner Robert Mitchell's false accusation, represented serious failure of law enforcement to employ appropriate force, that coroner's inquest dismissing medical evidence showing execution-style killing violated obligations to conduct objective review, that prosecutors' decision declining charges despite documentation of excessive force created environment where Marie Jackson's systematic elimination of 12 deputies was tragic consequence of complete accountability failure, that county commissioners' refusal to implement recommended reforms after being warned about excessive force pattern demonstrated dereliction of oversight responsibilities. Resolution was carefully worded to acknowledge system failures without explicitly justifying Marie's violence, reflected legislature's recognition that 93 years hadn't resolved questions about when vigilante justice becomes understandable, even though legal systems cannot sanction systematic killing. Modern law enforcement accountability advocates invoke Marie's case as historical example, demonstrating importance of independent review, prosecutorial willingness to charge officers when evidence warrants, oversight ensuring that excessive force patterns are addressed before additional victims suffer. Historical marker at Marie's prison grave was installed in 2023, inscription reading, Marie Jackson, 1890-1954, systematically killed 12 Gibson County deputies who shot 16-year-old son Thomas in back during 1931, arrest for theft that store owner Robert Mitchell later confessed fabricating. Coroner's inquest ruled shooting justified, despite medical evidence showing execution-style killing. Prosecutor declined charges. Sheriff Marcus Webb had pattern of excessive force that county commissioners had been warned about, but failed to address. Marie served 23 years before dying in prison. Her case prompted federal investigation, revealing accountability failures, and led to Tennessee reforms including mandatory autopsies for officer-involved shootings. 3 of 12 deputies had privately questioned shooting, but participated following Webb's orders under threat of termination. This grave reminds us that accountability failures create desperate responses, that protecting law enforcement from consequences when they execute innocent children motivates violence that might be prevented if systems fulfilled obligations to prosecute excessive force regardless of officers' claims or institutional pressures to protect personnel from accountability. If this complete expanded story made you grapple with irreducible complexity of maternal vengeance and system accountability across 93 years, the store owner's deathbed confession admitting deliberate lie that killed innocent child, the federal investigation revealing Webb's pattern of excessive force affecting multiple victims, the discovery that county commissioners had been warned years before Thomas's death but failed to implement reforms, the 3 deputies who'd privately questioned shooting but participated under threat of losing jobs, the impossible questions about whether killing 12 people could be justified when responding to execution of innocent child based on false accusation, and whether deputies following orders bear individual accountability or whether responsibility lies with sheriff who organized excessive force and county officials who enabled pattern leave your like and share. Subscribe for stories examining how law enforcement accountability failures create desperate family responses, how qualified immunity and prosecutorial discretion can protect excessive force until violence forces reforms that official channels refuse to implement, how maternal grief motivates systematic campaigns that courts must condemn, but that many people privately understand, resulted from institutional failures rather than from criminal nature. Comment about whether Marie's systematic elimination was proportional response to complete accountability failure, or whether alternatives existed she should have pursued, whether 93 years is sufficient time to judge whether violence was justified when contemporary accountability systems sometimes still fail to prosecute excessive force, whether memorial should emphasize Marie's desperation or focus on 12 deaths through vigilante execution. Because these questions persist wherever law enforcement uses excessive force, wherever accountability systems prioritize protecting officers over holding them responsible when they kill innocent people, wherever families must decide between accepting that authorities won't deliver justice and employing private violence, that legal systems cannot sanction, but that moral desperation sometimes motivates when alternatives have been exhausted, and when children remain vulnerable to officers whose excessive force patterns oversight failures have enabled to continue.